Okay, this is William Glasser, MD. He's our academic hero number 2. We're just going through some famous educators, the ones that I think are really good. So, for persons who want to help themselves with their own education, with their own understanding of their education, as well as who've got kids and want to help their kids, it's a good way to do it. Just going through the best educators that ever lived. So, this guy, William Glasser, was a psychiatrist and an educator. He lived from 1925 to 2013. He pioneered a concept of choice theory for helping his patients, but relevant to education, he ran his own school system called the quality schools. And one of the things you'll see is, yes, kids need to be told and taught certain things that they're just too young to understand or to know, but they also need to participate in their learning. Learning is not a passive thing, it's an active thing. And when the child's engaged and their curiosity is of interest for what they're learning, they learn a lot more. Okay, so the first quote from William Glasser, this is from his book Choice Theory. The skills of speaking and listening have the largest payoff of all we learn, especially when they're young. They should really spend a lot of time reading books and talking about books. And having adventures and discussing the adventure. Go to the zoo and talk about what you saw at the zoo. Getting that ability to see and describe. That's one of the reasons why I think drawing is good. You have to really observe to draw well. All these things make a person smarter. Active involvement in their learning. Next quote from Glasser. When students say we have a great teacher, what they are saying is that the teacher has taught them to use and improve knowledge. They require the students to think. It's an active process. Another great one, this is one I remember big time from Glasser. Our brains are not set up to memorize information we do not use. So if you're learning something or you want someone to learn something, like a kid in particular, they got to see a benefit in it, a reason why they need to learn it. To just learn something for a grade, you'll remember it up until you take the test, but it won't stay with you. Versus if you talk about something interesting and useful and study something interesting and useful, it'll stick with you your whole life. So the key thing is how important it is to you. So focus on things that are important to you. Here's another quote from William Glasser. A student should enjoy academic work is not a concern of traditional schools. It is perfectly acceptable to try to coerce students into doing totally worthless work, such as memorizing material that both they and their teachers know they will forget a few days after the test. This is the school equivalent of digging holes and then filling them in, a traditional punishment. Yeah, so a lot of stuff in school is a waste of time. So it's, if you really want to optimize education, you don't want to be wasting time. And one of the things I saw when I was growing up was my father read all the time. He's a bright guy. He's a physician, and he'd read a couple hours a day in the evening after work and whatnot. But he read more to relax himself versus my style of reading was that I would be interested in something. So I'd read a whole bunch of books on a topic because I wanted to argue with my uncle about it, or just because I wanted to know it for some other reason. And that helped my retention to be a lot better. So it's good to read in general. That just builds your vocabulary, your thinking ability, your verbal skills. But to read about something focused, I think, is better. Like if you're in a historical era, read all the books on that era. You'll retain it better. And part of the benefit of all this reading is it gives you historical perspective. Somebody who knows history, I can say, well, this is what it was like with the ancient Greeks. This is what it was like with the ancient Romans. This is what it was like with the Renaissance. And you've got historical perspective versus a lot of modern people, especially young people, they're ahistorical. They've got nothing to compare to, so they can't really, you understand and you learn by comparing stuff to what you already know. And if you don't have a historical timeline in your head, it's harder for you to make sense of things. Okay, the next one quote from Glasser is, the real excitement attached to learning anything is improving it. Yeah, it's fun to make things better. It's a lot more exciting to, go out bird watching and you study all the birds and then you figure out new ideas about bird watching. You'll learn a lot from that. For example, typically I went bird watching. I used to go bird watching by the Palo Alto Baylands by Stanford University. And at that time, I was thinking I want to be a wildlife biologist. So they didn't have a field guide for the birds of the Palo Alto Baylands. And at that age, I was all excited and energized. So I said, okay, I'll write a field guide of the Baylands. And that's the kind of thing kids should do. And they'll learn a lot from doing that. And that gives a student an advantage. If a student just takes a class for a grade, everybody in the class wants to get a good grade. But if the student wants to become a biologist, they'll do better in biology. If a student, whatever I was rotating in as a medical student or a resident, I would say to myself, well, who knows? Maybe I'll go into, being a surgeon. So I wanted to learn everything about surgery. Maybe I'll go into orthopedics. I was considered being an orthopedic surgeon. So I got to learn everything about the musculoskeletal system. And that really helped me a lot. Here's a funny quote. He was a psychiatrist, by the way, William Glasser. So here he says, the people who wrote DSM are crazier than the patients it describes. DSM is supposed to be about crazy people. Actually, it is written by crazy people. Okay, coming from a psychiatrist, him there. All right, next quote from William Glasser. We learn about 10% of what we read, 20% of what we hear, 30% of what we see, 70% of what we discuss, 80% of what we experience personally, and 95% of what we teach someone else. And there's a lot of truth in that. So basically, it's good to read, but you should take your reading and do something with it. Write a book, make a video, or what I found really helpful is if I read something interesting, I'll make a note of it. I'll make a summary note in the back of the book. For example, I just read this book, and I'll put all these notes in the back of the book here, okay? And then when I go back to the book, I'll have summarized the book here, or maybe even I hear an audio book, and I got this book in the room, I'll write a note in the back of the book just to remind myself of that, because I don't want to lose that piece of information. You need to have some type of memory retention system that you keep the knowledge that you get. You sort of trap it and stick it in your brain, associate it with something you already know, and then it'll stay long term. But what I like to do too is whenever I learn something interesting, I'll pick up the phone and I'll call one of my friends and I'll say, hey, do you know about this, or that? And that's really helpful because I know, for example, if I see an interesting case or I just learned something interesting, I'll call one of my doctor buddies and I'll be like, hey, what do you think of this, blah, blah, blah. And we'll have a quick conversation about it. And that conversation, it just seems to file it in my brain for long-term use versus if I don't talk to somebody about it, I need to see that material quite often more than once to stick it in my brain. But if I have at least one conversation, preferably 2 or 3 or more, that material will stay long-term. And I think there's something to be said for the old schoolhouse where older kids were combined in the classroom with younger kids, and then they would learn something, they would teach it to the younger ones. And the point being is they're learning the material and then teaching to somebody else. They're going to remember that material better that way. A lot of the best educated people have been homeschooled, and they would have conversations with their parents about a topic. So that's one way to retain knowledge long term. Because, for example, let's say you're trying to learn Spanish. If you try to learn to speak the language so you can read books you want to read in that other language, read philosophers or famous people in that other language that are of interest to you, that's great. If you have a friend you can converse with, that's great. If you like the music from that other country, you're using that Spanish knowledge you want that language for your own personal benefit. You're going to retain it a lot better than somebody who's just answering grammar questions for a test. That doesn't stay. Nobody learns a language from grammar. Grammar, helps a little here and there to refine it, but that's not how you learn it. Okay, here, Glasser's next quote. Education is not acquiring knowledge. It is best defined as using knowledge. For example, I was a wrestler when I was young. I would learn a technique, we would drill it, then you'd try to get it in practice competition, then an actual competition. If you could actually score with it, that was a good move and you want to remember it. But if it was something just that the coach was telling you and it didn't work for you, then it was kind of a waste of time. So you want to use the knowledge. Good knowledge is something usable, okay? Knowledge that low-fat, low-sodium diet is good for you, that's usable knowledge, useful knowledge. Okay, last quote from William Glasser. The best way to teach a skill-based curriculum is to relate it to what you are trying to teach in the real world. The information we are asked to memorize must be useful now or in the foreseeable future, or we won't make an effort to learn it no matter how much we are coerced to do so. And that's kind of the point, that if you learn something just because you have to for school, it's not going to stick with you probably. Versus if you think it's interesting and you'd like to have a conversation with it with a friend, or you'd like to write a paper about it, that's something that is more relevant to you and it's going to stick with you. And of course, sometimes you're just experimenting with exposure to different subjects, but it's also true that if you're trying to teach somebody something, you should talk about how it relates to them, because we only remember what we can associate and connect with something we already know. So it should sort of fit into their matrix of knowledge, their scaffold of knowledge, to make it be useful to them. So anyways, this was William Glasser, our second academic hero. Hope that's helpful.